Hello, everyone. My name is Carolina, and I'm representing Arkbound Foundation, a charity working to widen the access to literature and improve diversity within publishing. Today, we have with us Ashish Kothari, who has written a chapter for an upcoming Arkbound book named Climate Adaptation, which is coming out on the 25th of October this year. Ashish Kothari is one of the founders of Kalpavriksh, an Indian environmental NGO. He coordinates their program on alternatives. He is a graduate in sociology, having taught at the Indian Institute of Public Administration and been guest faculty at several universities, institutes, and colleges. He has also been a member and co-chair of several international committees of the IUCN and the World Commission on Protected Areas, and served on the board of directors of Greenpeace International and Greenpeace India. He has also served on the Indian government's committees to formulate India's Biological Diversity Act and National Wildlife Action Plan, and coordinated India's National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan process. He has also been active with a number of people's movements, and he helps coordinate the Alternatives Confluence, or Vikalp Sangam, in India, and the Global Tapestry of Alternatives globally, aside from authoring or editing over 30 books and numerous articles. Thank you so much for being here with us today, Ashish. Welcome.
Thank you.
Okay, so I would like to start the interview by asking you a little bit about your personal journey. So what led you to your current work with Kalpavriksh, Vikalp Sangam, and alternatives, and to ultimately contributing a chapter for this book?
Well, I was my youth was spent in New Delhi, and while I was in school, one of the things that I was very interested in animals and animal rights issues and wildlife conservation, and we used to go frequently to one of the forest areas in Delhi. It's one of the largest urban forests in the world, and we noticed quite a lot of destruction taking place because of urbanization and road building and things like that, and so we thought we should, apart from just enjoying ourselves in nature, we should also try and do something to protect it. And so amongst our first actions was a movement by youth, by school students and college students to protect the Delhi, it's called the Delhi Ridge Forest. That was one of there were 2 or 3 other similar actions that we took when some of us were in school or college. And when we were taking those actions, we also felt the need to actually start an organization so that we could do it much more systematically and bring attention to environmental issues, which very few people were talking about in those days in India, other than grassroots movements. So that's how Kalpavriksh was started. That's 42 years back, 1979. And after that, we got in touch with a lot of grassroots people's movements. For instance, the famous Chipko movement in the Himalaya of women trying to protect their forests, or the anti-mining movements in some parts of India, or the movement of traditional fishing communities to stop the commercialization of the coasts and marine areas. And from them, we learned a lot more about ecological issues, environmental issues, and also issues of livelihoods, development, well-being, gender inequalities, etc. So it's those first few years that were very formative for us.
Okay, and how did that initially lead to your work with alternatives? Because you are now basically focusing more on this type of work.
Yeah, so the first many years were spent on protesting or joining protests against destructive so-called development projects, and also critiquing development policies from the point of view of what it was doing to communities, to nature, to culture, etc. And that phase continued for quite a long time. But even as that was happening, we were more and more in touch with communities who were not just protesting, but also trying out their own ways of, for instance, growing food in non-destructive manners, or creating settlements, and basically living their lives in ways that were not ecologically destructive, either through their own traditional practices or maybe adopting some new ones. And so in that sense, there was already something in our heads which was saying that while we are opposing this form of development, or this form of political governance where some people take decisions for others, we were seeing in these communities answers to what would be the alternative to this kind of dominant model. So then, about 10 years back, we were already, some of us were already in this mode, and then a colleague and I wrote this book called Churning the Earth, which was a very detailed critique of economic globalization in India and its impacts on ecological, economic, and cultural life in India. And while doing that, it struck both of us, the two authors, that we also needed to have a detailed section on what is it we are saying yes to. If we're saying no to this model of globalized development, what are we saying yes to? And that's when a lot of those examples that I and others had seen on the ground kind of brought back into a much sharper focus on what would be alternatives for food, for energy, for housing, for governance, etc. And since then, around 2011-12 or so, over the last 10 years, my own focus has shifted much more to looking predominantly at alternatives. And within Kalpavriksh also, we set a program of work on that. And in 2014, we established the Vikalp Sangam, the alternatives confluence process, to try and do 2 or 3 kinds of things. One was to bring a lot of these alternative initiatives together, to learn much more, to do much more documentation. Because one thing we realized was that very few of these areas were actually documented. Very few people knew about them. Most of the media carries all the bad news. Good news, very few people tend to carry, because they don't think it's, I don't know, whatever. They don't get the ratings that they would want to get in their television shows and newspapers. But we felt it's equally important to bring out the good news, also to be able to inspire other people to do similar things and create hope, because otherwise we're living in an atmosphere of despair and doom, right? So essentially, it was like complementing the critiques and the protests and the resistance with what is really possible in terms of sustainable, equitable, more just living.
Okay, so you start the chapter with visioning the future in 2100 and looking back at the process of change to get there. So could you tell us a bit more about your own vision for the future?
Sure. Well, firstly, to say that it's not my own, in the sense it's not just emanated from my head. This is a lot of learnings from so-called ordinary people on the ground who are, like I said, who are already in many practicing or envisioning these sorts of presents and futures, but building also on the past. And so what I learned from them and built on this learning is that a vision of a future, or multiple visions of the future, in which there are sort of 5 crucial kind of transformations taking place. One is political, which is where, instead of thinking of democracy and governance as elections, and then we hope that the government will do the right thing, we think of democracy as power that is inherent in each one of us. And so therefore, wherever we are, a village community or a city neighborhood or a institution or an NGO, whatever, is that everybody is in that sense part of decision making on an equal plane. And so radical democracy of some kinds. Then that also means that we have to have much more localization with regard to politics, but also building in ecological and cultural and economic considerations into that. And that leads us to also kind of challenge some of the political boundaries that we have right now, which don't necessarily make ecological sense or cultural sense. But I'll come back to that later. The second crucial element of transformation is in the economic sphere, because I can't be in control of my life politically unless I also have some control over the means of production and consumption on which my life depends, right? So whether I'm a farmer or I'm an industrial worker or I'm a urban consumer or whatever, I can't be dictated to by corporations and governments in my economic life also. And also that we've tended to think of the economy as primarily finance, as money or financial exchanges and exchanges of give and take that are based on anonymous financial relationships, right? Whereas in fact, the economy is much more importantly exchanges based on sharing and caring. It's really about taking care of each other, taking care of myself, but also taking care of others through that kind of an economy. So it's this transformation, multiple transformations in economic life, which then also challenges the notion that a developed country is one where GDP is high, or economic growth rates are high, and all other countries are still developing or underdeveloped. Whereas in fact, this vision of economics would tend to think of, for instance, if you and I have a good relationship, or if I have a good relationship with nature, natural surrounds around me, then in that sense, I'm also economically I have well-being, right? Not necessarily financial wealth, but I have well-being. The third crucial transformation there would be in terms of social justice and equality, because we all live in societies which are unequal or unjust in one way or the other. It could be gender injustice or racism, or India casteism, which is very prevalent, or for instance, discrimination against so-called disabled people, and so on, multiple different kinds. And so the struggles for equality in human beings is a very important third component. Fourth one is cultural and knowledge diversity, that these kinds of initiatives that you've seen all over the world are based on building on people's own knowledge and their own cultures. And there's an enormous diversity of these around the world. We don't, what colonization has unfortunately done is to make us think that there's only one legitimate form of knowledge, which is modern science, and one legitimate technology, which is modern technology. It's made us think that the most important language to learn is, say, English or Spanish, whatever. Whereas in fact, there are thousands of languages around the world, right? And thousands of cultures, thousands of ways of being, ways of doing, ways of seeing, ways of eating, ways of knowing, ways of relating. And so this diversity is a very crucial component. Sustaining that diversity is very crucial in the face of the kind of colonization and even post-colonial homogenization that is taking place. And in that, the commons is very important, because not just commons in terms of nature and physical resources and so on, but also knowledge. So how do we make sure that knowledge is for everybody? It's not being privatized through intellectual property rights. And finally, the fifth sphere is of course ecological wisdom and resilience, because without sustaining the earth won't sustain us, right? So rebuilding our relationships within nature, not thinking of nature as separate, and bringing back the respect that we should have for all species, not just for human beings. So therefore, not just human rights, but also the rights of all of nature. And so it's these five crucial sort of spheres of transformation which lead to visions of society that are much more equitable, just, and sustainable. And finally, at the core of this we call this the flower of transformation, 5 petals. At the core of this is ethics. What are the values by which we live? Do we respect others? Do we work in solidarity with others, or do we selfishly and individualistically? Do we work for privatizing everything, or work for the commons? Do I respect your faith and your ideology, etc., or do I feel that only my faith is important? You must follow what I think and what I believe in. Do I value autonomy and freedom, and my community's autonomy and freedom? But while doing that, do I also respect your community's autonomy and freedom? So it becomes, in India we call that Swaraj. So sort of encompassing these sorts of things as self-rule, but in respect to other people's self-rule. So it's this and many other sort of ethics of generosity and love and so on, which kind of at the core of this kind of alternative visions of society.
Yes, that's a great vision of how things could be. But and at the moment, what would you say are the biggest challenges that are preventing us from reaching these desired visions of the future?
Well, one thing I think that's very important is that these are not only visions that could be, but they are already. And that's why one of our main tasks is to document where things are already happening. Like responsible autonomy is already being practiced in many communities in the world. In the larger scale, for instance, places like the Zapatista autonomous region in Mexico, the Kurdish Rojava autonomous eco-feminist based region in Western Asia. and many others like indigenous self-determination movements in many parts of the world. Or if you take, for instance, movements for food sovereignty or energy sovereignty, where communities are saying that we should be in control of everything to do with food or in control of our own energy, etc. And many, many others which are already there, they're already on the ground. But the problem is that they're still, this is one big challenge, they're still kind of scattered. They're not necessarily linked well enough to each other to create the critical mass that is needed for affecting the bigger, the macro changes in economy, politics, etc. that we need. And those are dominating those macro structures, whether it's capitalist corporations or it's centralized state regimes, or it's patriarchy and men, or it's certain, in racism, say the white race, so-called races, etc. These macro structures, or these underlying structures of oppression and unsustainability, are extremely powerful, and they continue to be. We are seeing, for instance, in many parts of the world, the return of authoritarianism and even more exploitative practices by corporations, including during the COVID pandemic period. And so these sorts of practices and visions of alternatives face this wall of dominant systems. Secondly, I think one very big challenge is that these systems have also brainwashed all of us. So each one of us, even if I'm poor and oppressed by the system, I would think that, no, if I just manage to get into the system in some way or the other, I will also become rich or powerful or famous, right? And so in that sense, it's like it's very difficult to convince people that there are alternative ways of living. Everybody thinks that, not everybody, but most people tend to think that this Western style materialist, consumerist economic development is the way to go. And so that's a huge challenge. How do we shift mindsets? How do we shift hearts? How do we shift ways of seeing and doing and so on, um, which are aligned much more towards the kind of thing we're talking about. When we are confronted with every day of our life, every minute of our lives, we're confronted with, for instance, advertisements that convince us that, no, this is the only way to go. So that's another huge challenge. I mean, there are many others, but I would say these are sort of two, three: the cultural challenge, and then the sheer challenge of the might of the current system against which we're fighting.
Okay, and one of the things that you also mentioned, and that struck me, is the notion of radical democracy. What makes democracy radical, and how does it play a role in, well, making at least visions more widespread, let's say?
So actually, one should not need to qualify democracy by saying radical, but why we do that is because while the original meaning of democracy is power of the people, right, the rule of the people, that's the literal translation of democracy. But Western liberal democracy has kind of, again, brainwashed for many generations, brainwashed us into thinking that the best form of democracy is the electoral representative form, which is what we have across the world right now. Whereas what we're saying, as I said earlier, is that democracy is about people claiming and taking responsible power wherever they are. And this also then changes the meaning of power, because again, in the sort of Western liberal form of democracy, it's power to dominate somebody else or something else. Whereas in this alternative form, we're saying it's power with or power to. So power to do something good, or my power with your power to actually do something good for everybody. And so in that sense, radical, as you know, doesn't mean extreme. It means going to the roots. One of the things is that we tend to forget original meaning of words. People have forgot the original meaning of democracy. Similarly, we say radical, people say, oh, no, that's very extreme, and people are killing each other. Actually, it just means going to one's roots, ecological roots, cultural roots, our roots as a human being or as life, as a living person. So in that sense, radical democracy, then that's why we qualified, just to kind of make it explicit that we're talking about power on the ground of people in their day-to-day lives, to be able to control their lives, their economies, their society in the way that they want. But, and that's why we added ecological also. Radical ecological democracy is what we call it in our India, in our work in India, is to then say that it's power with responsibility not only towards other human beings, but towards all of life. So all of nature is to be respected when I'm exercising that power, or when my community is exercising that power. And again, I bring back the notion of Swaraj, because in India, Mahatma Gandhi made this notion very famous, though it's a much older notion, much older than him, but he made it very famous during the independence struggle. But it wasn't only about independence from colonial British rule, but it was about this notion that autonomy and freedom is very important, and I will claim it as my birthright, but with responsibility towards other people, and we add ecological, so towards the rest of to all species.
One other thing that you mentioned is that we need deep change, the systemic change. And we do have the notion that individual actions alone won't bring about this type of change, but still local initiatives are necessary. So what do you consider to be the role of small local initiatives in helping achieve the deep systemic change that we need?
I think it's actually the most important component. It's not adequate, but it's the most important component for many reasons. But one very important reason is that as human beings, we feel meaning in our life when things are at a human scale. When something becomes so big that I have no sense of, I can't even fathom the proportion of that. And that's a problem, for instance, when talking about, say, global climate change, or when talking about the World Wide Web. I don't really know how it works. I feel I have no control over it. I can't intervene, etc. But I know that I can intervene in things in my locality or around me, yeah, or in a collective, let's say. And that collective doesn't have to be place-based. That's the most important. But it could also be virtual collectives, for instance. But in some way or the other, I have, say, a voice, and I can affect the decision making in that locality, that collective, right? So in that sense, the local becomes the most meaningful part of action and thinking and doing and vision. But that's not enough. And so we need to make sure that the local here and the local there and the local there are able to connect up with each other. Because one thing that's very important, at least what I've learned from these initiatives, is that it's not about replicating something from one place to another place. Because no two places are the same. You can learn the lessons, learn the ethics, learn the principles, learn the processes, and then apply it in your own way with modifications that are needed. Nor is it a right approach to say, let's upscale. So supposing there's a fantastic agroecological initiative somewhere, people are growing their own food sustainably, organically, etc., and doing fantastic work. It's not that they should become bigger and bigger and bigger and become like a corporation that rules the whole world, but that somebody else learns from them. They go and teach what they've convey what they've learned, etc., and it kind of spreads in that horizontal, distributed manner, and then links up. And it's that linking up that creates the scale for the larger change that is needed. You can see that, for instance, in some parts of the world where agroecological movements of sustainable farming have gotten together to create a much larger movement for shifting away from unsustainable chemical-based agriculture to smallholder, small farmer-based sustainable organic, biologically diverse farming on a much larger scale, but in this distributed manner. So in that sense, I would say local is the most important for all the reasons I've just stated, but that's not adequate. You need to create from the local to larger and larger scales all the way to the global. And in fact, in that sense, also kind of to some extent dissolve the boundary between local and global. Because if you have a fantastic local initiative and somebody else from 1,000 kilometers learns from it and does something there, that local is also global. And the global manifests itself locally. in the way, for instance, if climate is affecting me in some way, it's affecting me locally. So it's also a binary that needs to be kind of dissolved, which one can do through this kind of interlinking, interlocking, which is what we try and do through the Vikalp Sangam process in India and through the Global Tapestry of Alternatives, which I can talk about.
Yes, I was going to ask you about this next. So in coordinating Vikalp Sangam, so how are you working to bring these different local voices to the conversation and protecting the different types of knowledge?
Yeah, so I mean, the idea, it started in 2014, and the idea was that we had platforms in India that were resistance movements being able to come together. For instance, a very important platform called the National Alliance for People's Movements. And we were, in that sense, also associated, linked up with that. But we didn't have anything which was bringing together movements for alternatives. I mean, there were elements of this, of course, also in the resistance movements. Sometimes they're all the same, but there wasn't like a sustained, systematic focus on that. That's why we started this process in 2014. And one very important principle in that was what I just said, is that we will respect the ways in which somebody is doing something in their own local area. We're not going to say that, no, you have to learn from here and do exactly what they're doing. Everybody has their own ways of doing things. But that this platform provides a way by which you can kind of translate, I don't mean language translations, but like translate this knowledge that people have generated, these ideas, these practice that people have generated into a way, form that others can kind of learn from. So that was a very important part of it. The second thing was then to be able to create the actual physical collaborations, to expand one's work, to plug gaps. If I'm, for instance, weak in something and you're strong in it, then our collaboration would make me also strong in it. So that was the second very important part to it. The third is collective visioning, because when I'm doing something on the ground on, say, agriculture or gender justice, whatever, I have my own vision. My community, my collective has its own vision of how to do things. Somebody else has theirs. It's when we sit together and say, okay, how does your vision and my vision kind of match up? What are the differences? What are the commonalities? How do we build something that's more collective so that we can think of, say, India as a whole? That collective visioning is very important, which is what I've written about quite a lot in the article that I've given for your book. And yeah, so it's really that's the sort of attempt, and with all of that, also then to create a platform from where advocacy can take place. So if we are convinced that this is the direction that needs to be taken, then we will put out a statement, we will ask for policy shifts, etc. Not that we have too much hopes on our government, I mean, especially the current government, not at all. But it's still good to put out policy directions, policy statements for people to learn from, and even for grassroots initiatives to kind of connect to. And maybe some people in government might be listening and then they pick it up. So advocacy also is a crucial part of this. And fifth, and I think probably the most important, is creating a sense of a place for participation and a sense of hope for the youth. Because if major changes are going to take place, it will be through youth movements. It's always been, I think, through history, and all over the world, we see young people are rising up. They don't want the current system. They're protesting. They're trying to ask for alternatives. And so, having a place where they could come and learn things, be part of it, feed their own process and their own ideas into it, becomes a very important part of this process. So that's what we're trying to do in India. I mean, it's still small. There are about 75 organizations and national level networks and organizations that are part of it. And we're trying to grow it also to become sorry, that's one important part I forgot, is to create a space for intersectoral or intersectionality, as it's called, so that gender justice folks, sustainable agriculture folks, alternative education folks, community health folks, all these people can be talking to each other and be able to maybe even constructively critique, because I may not have thought adequately of, say, inclusion for disability. or something else in my own work, and somebody else may not have thought of ecological resilience in their work. And so you kind of constructively critique and then build these strengths, hopefully to build these strengths into each other across sectors. That's becomes very important. So yeah, that's what the attempt is. But much more has to be done.
And I'm also curious on how the work with Vikalp Sangam connects with the work of at a more global level with the tapestry, the global tapestry of alternatives. So if you could let us know a little bit about that.
Sure. So I mean, many of us have been part of processes of connecting to similar movements in other parts of the world. And in particular, I think from 2013-14 onwards, I was in touch with some of the degrowth movement folks in Europe, and also in a couple of these international degrowth conferences, got in touch with some of the movements in Latin America for bringing back their visions, like Buen Vivir and Sumak Kausai and so on, into current life. And so we started realizing that just like in India, similarly across the world, there isn't a platform for bringing radical systemic alternatives together. One of the platforms that to some extent has done this is the World Social Forum. It's the world's largest forum for civil society action, global forum. But again, there also a lot of the focus has been on the resistance and the critique, and not so much systematically on, its slogan is "Another world is possible," and that's a very important slogan. But it hasn't worked systematically towards what are those other worlds that are not just possible but already to some extent existing. And so in 2016, I proposed during the International Degrowth Conference in Budapest that why don't we create a international, I at that point said Global Kalpsangam because I was presenting the idea of Kalpsangam, or a global or Earth Confluence, Earth Alternatives Confluence. And many other people kind of liked it, picked up the idea. It took us 2-3 years more to kind of build on it and sort of look at what is it really possible, is it feasible, what could be done, what are the existing forums which we don't want to duplicate, how do we build relationships with the existing international processes like the World Social Forum. So it's actually only 2018-19 that it really got going and launched in 2019. We also used those 2-3 years to build a lot more endorsement from global networks. So once we had about 25-30 global or regional networks on board, that's when we launched it in 2019. And we also found that, like Vikalp Sangam, there were similar processes in a few other parts of the world. So in Mexico and Colombia, for instance, there's a process called Crianza Mutua, which is somewhat similar, not quite the same, but somewhat similar, trying to create a platform for alternative thinking and doing. And or you had, for instance, the Commons movement, which has been doing this for the movement for re-commoning of public spaces and so on, and others. So the idea is talk to a lot of these people, get their inputs, and then start it. So that's why we started in 2019, and now we have about 50 global and regional networks and organizations that are endorsers of the process. And we've been slowly trying to what we call weave this global web of dialogues, collective action, etc. Unfortunately, of course, the last 1.5 years has been rather tough to do this. Everything's online, which is not the best way of weaving. But anyway, we've been trying, and we hope that we'll also be able to have physical confluences in some parts of the world without having a huge ecological footprint with people flying all over the world, but to do it in sort of marginal ways and maybe once in a while globally.
So one thing that I would also like to ask more towards the end is, I really liked a sentence that you used, which was, it is the process that is important as much, if not more, than the final outcome. So it really puts us out of our linear thinking of achieving something necessarily, and that's the end goal. So can you give us maybe an example that is close to your heart of something you were involved in, where you saw this in reality?
Yeah, I think I mentioned in the article, in 2000, we were given the task of coordinating India's national biodiversity strategy and action plan. Rather unusual that an NGO was asked to do this, but by the government, but there it was. And what we did was we changed the entire initial design of it to make it a much more participatory process of doing things all over the country, from grassroots communities to academic institutions to NGOs to government officials to businesses, etc., and try and build both a grounded and a national vision of how would one protect India's biodiversity while also enhancing and sustaining livelihood security, economic security, etc. So, unfortunately, at the end of the 4 years, even though the government is the one which commissioned us to do this, and they liked the process all the way till the end, but at the end, the outcome, the final report which came out of this, which is a very, very detailed report, was rejected by the government because they realized it's too radical. And remember, I'm using radical in the real sense, because it asked for fundamental changes in economic models and political models and all of that. It was too hot for them to handle. So they rejected it, and which was, of course, a huge disappointment because obviously we were also focused on the outcome. But because the process had been so participatory, there were tens of thousands of people who were involved in it, in a number of places on their own, people were taking this ahead on their own steam. I mean, to give you one example, a process of doing biodiversity festivals was started during this period, and from one place it actually began. It got exported elsewhere and elsewhere, and now if you look at it, there are biodiversity festivals by people bringing back their traditional crop diversity or vegetable diversity or sustaining wild diversity and the cultures associated with it in many different parts of India. Similarly, people who were part of this were kind of continuing to put pressure on their own local governments at the district and state level that we need, these are the kinds of changes that we need. So while the sort of final main outcome was rejected, the process created its own momentum, which hopefully was able to create transformations and changes, at least in some parts of India. Whereas suppose we had come into the same report, we could have sat in Delhi and written up a radical report, probably not the same depth or whatever, but it could still have said somewhat similar things. Without there being any process, then we would have nothing left at all. I mean, that would have been rejected, and there was no ground level process to sort of create the momentum for change. So I would give that as an example, and that's why for us the GPA or Vikalp Sangam, it is again the processes that are how are people involved, how much, at what levels are they involved, how much are people being listened to, how much cross-cultural and cross-sectoral dialogue is taking place. Whether a report comes out of that or not is less important than having those platforms of dialogue and discussion and action.
That was a wonderful example. Thank you for sharing. And I would also like to ask you about the hopes for this book that is coming out. What do you hope that the book will achieve?
Well, I think having been part of lots of books in the last few years, I've realized that books have their own both potential and limitations. To start with the limitations, books are read by a few people unless it happens to become a bestseller, which is not likely to. It's not a piece of fiction or whatever which can become a bestseller. And most non-fiction books don't really become bestsellers, but it's read within certain circles. If it is projected well, it could hopefully be also read outside our normal circles by people who are looking for something different or at least open-minded enough to learn from it. But it's limited. So in that sense, the book does have and of course, it's not accessible to those who can't read or who can't read, let's say, English or whatever languages the book comes out in. So there are those limits, but the potential, I think, is enormous in the sense that if it gets into the right hands, if it's read by the right, by people who have the power to change things. And again, I'm not talking only about politicians and bureaucrats and so on. I'm talking about so-called ordinary people. And somebody sort of looks at it and says, oh, if this is possible there, why can't we do it here? Creating the inspiration, helping to create some of the mind shifts and the heart shifts that I spoke about earlier is something that a book, and especially if the book also is accessible, it's written in a form that a lot of people can understand, it's not too much jargon. And maybe also then it gets converted into a few other forms. I mean, it gets converted, say, into shorter articles. It gets converted into maybe some short videos. I mean, you're doing these video interviews, so that would also add, because there's a visual component also that gets built in. Maybe somebody picks it up and creates a graphic novel out of it, or some series of cartoons. If that happens, I think then it reaches more and more people. And so that's what my hope would be, that it helps to create an atmosphere of inspiration and hope in the midst of what is today a very dark atmosphere of despair and doom. That's what we really need out of all these events.
So one final question is, if people, just a short question, if people were to take just one message from your chapter, what would you like that message to be?
I would say keep dreaming, because like I said, we often get sunk in despair. And if you look at it, whether it's the sort of progressive constitutions of the world, or it's progressive science fiction, or it's people who've done some amazing actions that others get inspired by, it's that which has helped us to break out of despair and gloom. And a very crucial part of this in all these moments has been dreaming and visioning, and never thinking that there's anything wrong with it, because with the moments we have our feet on the ground, but aiming for the sky also becomes very important.
Thank you so much, Ashish, for being here with us today. It has been wonderful talking to you and hearing about the wonderful work that you are doing. And for those watching, if you are interested after watching this interview, in the description you can find links to check out the Climate Adaptation book, where you can find Ashish Kothari's chapter, and you can also find links to the projects that we've been mentioning, such as Kalpavriksh, Vikalp Sangam, and the Global Tapestry of Alternatives. Thank you again, Dr. Ashish.
Thank you. All the best for the book.
Thank you.